Welcome back. Well, Dick Cheney is not the most public of vice presidents the United States has ever seen, but he is one of the most powerful people in Washington. Cheney was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush Sr. and directed the first war in Iraq, Operation Desert Storm. It was Cheney who secured the cooperation of Saudi Arabia during that war, convincing then King Fahd to allow US troops on Saudi soil. As vice president, he's resisted any warming of relations with Iran. It's been reported his office rebuffed a 2003 offer from Iran to help the US stabilize Iraq, despite the fact that Colin Powell's State Department was said to be keen on the idea. Well, welcome again our guests, Harlan Ullman, a military and foreign policy analyst in Washington, D.C., and Anas Al-Takriti, a political analyst based in London. Anas Al-Takriti, let me start with you, if I may, because at the Arab Summit in Riyadh in March, King Abdullah condemned the US occupation of Iraq as illegal. I think you mentioned it earlier on in the show. How will the Saudis be viewing Dick Cheney's tour?
Well, I think that there is now the perception that this is an administration that is about to end effectively by the year 2008, in a few months' time. People in Washington will be totally submerged with all the campaigning that will carry on for the next 12 months. So there is a realization that now the ground must be prepared and laid for the administration that is coming after after this particular era, and most people are pinning their hopes on the Democrats. The fact of the matter is that the past 7 years have been, in the eyes of the Arab world, and maybe even far beyond, maybe even the world in its entirety, have been quite disastrous. Look back 7 years ago and look back at where we are today. The world is a far, far less secure, far less forgiving place than it ever was 7 years ago. So I think that there is a perception that Dick Cheney, it's good to talk. He's an important person. Of course, some see him as being possibly the most powerful person in Washington. So they'll speak to him, but in the back of their minds, it'll be the fact that in a few months' time, he will no longer be.
Let's just continue with the Saudi Arabian influence there for a second and put that point to Harlan Ullman in Washington. How does King Abdullah's statement there that we're talking about really underline the growing differences between Washington and Riyadh?
Well, it should, and I hope it's a wake-up call to Washington. The strategy, despite the so-called surge, has really been stay the course. We have been arguing to put more pressure on the Iraqi government, the Maliki government, to try and have reconciliation. But we don't seem to understand that there are profound differences in Iraq that are not easily resolved. If you think about it, the American Revolution ended in 1783, and yet our Constitution wasn't written until 1789, and we still had some big problems in it that led to a civil war in 1861. So let me make 2 points from an American perspective. First, I believe that the importance of Vice President Dick Cheney has been exaggerated. It is my view that George Bush is calling most of the shots, and Bush has always had a cabinet with different views. Cheney has been one of the most hawkish, and I think when the purposes suited the president, Cheney was being rolled out to represent that view, and when the president was trying to seem to be less aggressive, then Condoleezza Rice, and before her, Colin Powell were used. So I think that really you have to understand that George Bush is a much more controlling president than people think. Second, right now there is just a huge scramble for the presidency, and it's not clear whether the Democrats or the Republicans are going to win because we don't know who's going to run. But because the nature of the primaries are front-loaded by February of '08, there will certainly be 2 declared candidates for the Republicans and Democrats. But let's not forget that that does not necessarily disempower the president. He's still the commander-in-chief. He can still do whatever he wants in Iraq and elsewhere. And I think George Bush is the sort of person who is going to keep power and control for as long as he can. So even though there will be the presidential elections, I don't think that's going to diminish what George Bush hopes to do. What will diminish what George Bush will be able to do is what's happening in Iraq. My guess is the situation is not going to get better. More Americans are going to be killed in the surge. There's little real evidence to show that conditions are improving. If you just look at electrical production, oil production, hospital and medical services, the amount of internal and external refugees, by most measures in terms of society in Iraq, things are not getting better. And so that will be the issue which I think will hurt Mr. Bush most.
Okay.
Now, a final point. we have extended our tours of service for the Army to 15 months. To put it bluntly, we are really running out of troops. And so a year from now, it's going to be very difficult to be able to sustain this level of deployment. Also, the morale of our forces in Iraq remains very, very, very high.
All right.
If that were to change, we're going to have a huge problem, and so will Mr. Bush.
All right, let's bring back Anas Al-Takriti in London back into the discussion here, because of course one of the big complaints from the Arab world is that the US doesn't consult them enough. I mean, will this trip by Dick Cheney help to mend some of those fences, do you think?
I doubt it very, very much, and unless, as you mentioned in your introductory, that he has a rabbit that he's about to pull out of his hat. I doubt very, very much that either Dick Cheney or the Bush administration will actually be in a position to radically change their ways, and this is what is actually needed, a radical change of ways. Over the past 2 years, the entire world, particularly the Arab world and especially the Iraqis, have been waiting for the moment when someone as prominent as Dick Cheney or even possibly the president himself come out and admit that what happened in Iraq was a catastrophe and that the Iraqi people have suffered as a result. Some sort of acknowledgement of a blunder done in the best of intentions maybe, but some sort of acknowledgement. Unfortunately, that has never been coming. So unfortunately, the confidence in that this administration will actually change its ways is extremely low, and the trust that there will actually be any kind of movement on the ground, any kind of change for anything better inside Iraq, is almost next to zero. And I agree entirely with your guest from Washington. Things inside Iraq are looking to get far worse, not better.
Harlan Ullman, let me ask you a brief point about the Baker-Hamilton report, because I want to ask you, where does this trip sit, along with current US policy, against the backdrop of the Iraq study group and the recommendations they made?
Well, unless Mr. Cheney is prepared to embrace Iran and Syria and launch a diplomatic initiative that relies very much on the partnership of the Arab states in the region, it doesn't embrace it at all. And in fact, Mr. Cheney was not taken with the Iraq study group report, and indeed, I think, rebutted it. So I don't think there's any direct linkages, but Mr. Al-Takriti is absolutely right. Unless there's a new vision, unless there's a profound change of policy, things are not going to get better. And unless there's a real catastrophe of some sort, heaven forfend, I don't think that the Bush administration is really going to change course. Now, there's one exception. If the United States were really clever, or if the leadership were, it ought to be discussing with the Iraqi government some situation where the Iraqis would say, as of the 1st of October, or some date such as that, they will be responsible for all security, irrespective of the surge in Baghdad. And from that point, the Americans can begin a redeployment. If we don't have that kind of cover of legitimacy from the Iraqis in terms of their assuming greater responsibility from their security, then we are stuck. This becomes a huge tar baby, and the next president of the United States is going to have a catastrophic or potentially catastrophic situation on his or her hands.
Anas Al-Takriti in London, let me come back to you, because with Iraq disintegrating and Iran obviously trying to increase its sphere of influence within the region, how nervous are Arab leaders, and what will they be saying to Dick Cheney?
Well, they're nervous. I think that's that's a given. Of course, if Iran was to expand in terms of its power and influence, a lot of countries along the Persian Gulf, the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, possibly even further, arching maybe even towards Lebanon and Syria, a lot of changes would occur, and a lot of people would be very, very nervous indeed. However, I think we also overplay the role of Iran in the region. Iran, like any other country, particularly in the face of any kind of external threat, will try to make as much movement and shield itself from any imminent threat as possible. And I think that's a natural occurrence of what we ourselves here in the West have instigated. When we talk about Iran, when we meet with governments throughout the Arab world and far beyond, we talk a language that is extremely threatening. We talk of Iran in terms of an enemy. And that, of course, rattles the cage. And therefore, of course, Iran will act in the way that it is. However, I think at the same time, I think that the leadership of the Arab and Middle Eastern countries are also playing a particular ploy in which they are also utilizing the influence of Iran for their own good. You see, whilst we condemn the role of the Iranian government inside Iraq, we also ask of Iran and speak to Iran in order to have a more positive role, to lessen its negative kind of impact and play a more positive role inside Iraq, because whether we like it or not, Iran is a major player inside the region. America seemingly wants to totally marginalize Iran. In fact, it wants to put it on the defensive and maybe even attack it. That is not the kind of policy, I feel, that would bring any kind of stability, neither in Iraq or the wider region.
Okay, let's get a final thought from Harlan Ullman. Do you think this trip will promote national reconciliation within Iraq? Will it be successful?
Sadly, I'm afraid it will not, but let me just make another observation, a wild card. Do not forget what's happening in Israel right now. Prime Minister Olmert has got no public rating. It's been rated at 0 or just a couple of percent. My guess is that his position is doomed over the longer term. Labor is liable to win. If that's the case, then Prime Minister will become Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a very, very conservative, hawkish-like person. And I think if that happens, that will really compound the issue with Iran, because now you have the Bush administration and potentially a Netanyahu administration who don't want to see Iraq become nuclear. And Mr. Al-Takriti is absolutely right. We over-exaggerate the power and influence of Iran on the one hand, and on the other hand, we don't take enough initiative to try and damp down some of the differences that make them afraid of us. And so under these circumstances, one could see a perfect storm brewing, perhaps.
Okay, Harlan Ullman in Washington, D.C. and Anas Al-Takriti in London. Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.